Welcome to the Family Beacon podcast from Minnesota Family Council with hosts Grace Evans and Moses Brattrud. Stay informed on the top stories on life, family, and religious freedom. Get the facts, stand for truth.
Hello and welcome to the Family Beacon podcast from Minnesota Family Council. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is an extremely special episode because, as I was saying to Representative Hudson a moment ago, this is the first time in 3 years of doing this that we have had an elected official on our podcast. And it's really exciting to me that Representative Hudson is the first one, because in his short time at the legislature, he has made a mark. And we're going to talk about that. And you were elected last fall. Sorry, fall of 2022.
Correct. Yes.
And I don't think you knew that when you were elected that you were going to have the insane roller coaster session that we ended up having this past year.
No, I mean, we certainly anticipated a very different result. Everyone was talking about the red wave, right?
Right.
And so the expectation was, and you try to be cautious about these things, but the expectation was that we were going to win, we were going to have a majority, we were going to be in charge the way things happened down in the legislature, and that we were going to be able to do the things we wanted to do. And the experience that we ended up having in 2023 was very much the opposite of that. We were railroaded at every turn, and we had to contend with what that feels like, which is not good.
I'm sure. And I want to back up a little bit, because I'm assuming that before you got into politics, which was not that long ago, you, and I can tell because you seem very normal. So you obviously haven't been in the swamp for too long. I assume that before this, you had a day job, and maybe you still have a day job, where people don't just yell at you all the time and just shout horrifying abuse at you, which I've seen that you get on Twitter and probably on other platforms. X, formerly Twitter. So what led you to say, I'm gonna cross into no man's land. I'm gonna do this. I'm not gonna just let someone else do it. I'm gonna do this.
Yeah, I've been doing what would be considered blue collar work for my entire adult life, and continue to work in management in that regard. But I've always had a strong interest in the political, and that began in high school. I did what a lot of listeners may recognize as PTSO, or the post PSEO. Thank you.
The thing they tried to ban.
Yes, I was getting that conflated with PTSD because that's what it felt like coming out of the 2023 legislative session.
I'm sure.
But yes, PSEO, post-secondary enrollment options, where I got to spend part of my time at community college. And so when I was driving from high school to the college, was right in that 11 o'clock space, and that's when Rush Limbaugh was on.
Sure.
And back in those days, my knowledge of him was framed by the mainstream, which is he's basically a grand wizard for the KKK, and yada yada. And so as a teenager, of course, my thought process is, well, that should be entertaining. Let's see what he has to say. And much to my amazement, I realized that all the things that he was saying were just like common sense, normal stuff that I and everyone I know believes. And so why is that so offensive? And that kind of became the catalyzing moment that got me interested in politics. And then life happens, you meet someone, you get married, you spend a few years out of state. And when I came back and we started to have children, that was the moment that the Tea Party dawned with the first term of Barack Obama. And that's when I started to get my hands dirty. I started to get involved. I formed a Tea Party organization. I became the chair of a statewide Tea Party organization. And I had a little bit of a background in broadcast radio and print media. And so I kind of gravitated towards personalities like Sue Jeffers and the folks at KTLK. And
sure.
Eventually that led to the opportunity to be an evening radio host, which I did for about 3 years.
Oh, wow.
And,
so this isn't your first merry-go-round. Before you were elected, you had plenty of experience in front of the mic.
Correct.
Gotcha.
Yes. And I was active in, it's kind of funny. I've lived in a lot of places in the metro. I've convened caucuses in a lot of different BPOUs. I've seen it a lot of different ways. And when we landed in Wright County in Albertville, where we are now, I had no anticipation that I was going to have the opportunity to run for anything, because we have really good, solid representation. There's no reason to challenge anybody.
Mm-hmm.
But the redistricting process that happens every 10 years after caucus or after the census shakes the table up and pieces fall off the board. And you got all these open spaces and it creates opportunities. And that's what happened in this case is Representative Lucero, then Representative Lucero, had an open Senate district that he had the opportunity to run for, and that left his seat open, which I was more than willing to step into and finally get into the arena.
Sure. So even though you're relatively new to elected office, you've been in the game.
Yeah.
You've been in local politics. You've been in radio.
Yep.
So it wasn't, perhaps for other people who haven't had that experience, it would have been more of a baptism by fire. But sounds like you knew a little bit of what you were getting into.
The most common metaphor you hear from newly elected officials is drinking from the fire hose. I did not have that same experience. I sat on a city council for 7 years.
Okay.
I had all the other experience we talked about. So for me, I had that kind of framework through which to filter the experience. I understand the drinking from a fire hose, what that is describing.
Right.
But I had a little bit of an advantage in being able to understand how to prioritize all the information that's coming at you and focus on what you want to focus on.
Sure. So this, now that you are in elected office, I should say statewide office, not statewide office. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's a state government,
office.
state
Yes.
office.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
What are your main priorities as a legislator?
I mean, so my priority overall is individual liberty, right? I hold life to be the moral standard of value, human life. And our public policy really ought to be centered on that. And that should go without saying, but it doesn't.
Right.
And liberty is not just something that would be nice to have. It's an essential component of our human nature. What distinguishes us from lower life forms, from animals, is the fact that we actually need to engage our cognition. We need to reason. We need to observe. We need to process. We need to synthesize. We need to come to decisions. We need to make choices. That's what morality is. It's the code that you utilize in order to choose what you're going to do in any given moment, from the trivial to the extremely significant, sacred, and what have you. And so having the freedom to follow your conscience in whatever area of life you're dealing with is absolutely essential to being an actualized human person. And government's job is to preserve the capacity of each person within their jurisdiction to be able to do that, provided that they are not abusing their freedom to encroach upon the rights of others.
That's really interesting. So would you call yourself a conservative? Of course you would. But this, I had a recent conversation with a libertarian. It was interesting. Could you briefly say, for my own curiosity, what do you think makes your position different from what a libertarian would say?
It's so fascinating that you asked that question, because I have a very contentious relationship with the libertarian community, because I have very intentionally attempted to reclaim the libertarian label to mean the dictionary definition of the word. The dictionary definition of the word is an advocate for liberty, which I most certainly am. And every conservative that I know most certainly is. The tension arises in distinguishing liberty from licentiousness.
Sure.
Right.
Which our founding fathers recognized.
100%.
Yeah.
That you actually, and this lies at the root of where I feel our job on our side of the cultural battle. The root of what it is that we need to get at is this point, which is that one is not entitled to liberty. One must earn the capacity to live free by developing their own sense of responsibility and duty and honor and virtue. Like when you are a moral and religious people, as our founding fathers noted, then you get to be free. That's how it works. It's not, we're going to give you freedom to just do whatever whimsical thing comes into your mind. And this is very obvious when people get all kind of wrinkly about this type of idea. I just point them to the parent-child relationship, right? Like your child is not free in any meaningful sense of the word.
Right.
You are very much guiding and constricting the scope of their possible behaviors and bringing them back on course whenever they deviate. And you're not doing that because you're a dictator. You're not doing that because you hate them. You're not doing that as some sort of violation of their rights. Quite the contrary. What you're trying to do is develop their capacity to utilize their judgment to make good choices that are healthy for them and wholesome and edifying and productive,
Right.
so that as they develop that capacity, you can let go.
Mm-hmm.
And these are the errors, a lot of the parental errors that occur through the course of a child being raised are not getting that balance right at any given stage.
Sure.
It's like when they're young, they need to be well constrained. And as they develop the ability to make good decisions and have rational values that they pursue, you need to be willing to let go and let them be their own person.
Sure.
Now, that's a difficult metaphor to just copy and paste onto government, because the government is not our parent,
right,
and we are not children as adults.
So it's sort of like we have been under the tutelage of the people who came before us.
Yes.
Like our either our literal parents or the people who were preserving our freedoms and our liberties in Minnesota and in this country from 1776 to today. And now you're saying, yeah, like that's right. And our job is to pass on those, not just values, but that whole system onto our literal children, and also just everyone else who is going to come after us in our society. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, there's and this will be a controversial clip for somebody to snip out of this, but there is a nugget of truth into what Hillary Clinton said regarding it takes a village that often gets missed by the conservative side of this cultural debate. Sometimes individualism can become a sin.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Right. It can be taken to an extent where it becomes an error. The fact of the matter is we do have communal responsibilities. And if you go back and you look at biblical accounts, I mean, Achan is an example that I point to all the time with ancient Israel and, him disobeying God and taking spoils from Jericho that he wasn't supposed to take.
Right.
There were 30 some odd men who didn't do what he did, paid the price for what he did.
Mm-hmm.
There is such a thing as communal responsibility. And so when it comes to things like your parental role or your role as a civic agent in voting or engaging in politics, you have to be, the serenity prayer comes to mind of accepting the things that you cannot change. You have to be willing to approach the process with a certain degree of grace and acceptance that God's will is going to be done regardless of your will. However, if you're apathetic and you pretend as though you only need to care about what you're doing and what you think and what your values are and what's important to you, you're going to get what you deserve in terms of the communal consequence of that attitude.
That's really interesting. And I think that gets into something I was going to ask you, because I've seen you talk about this. You and I know that there are plenty of Christians in every denomination who are allergic to politics. And, I think we all understand that, it's gross, who wants to actually turn that on? And we all understand that a steady diet of that can be really unhealthy and we need to, detox. But there are Christians who think, for theological reasons, like because we have here no lasting city, or because we're, not to pick on Baptists, but like Baptists have like a lot of theological reasons going back hundreds of years to not engage in the civil government. But nowadays, I think many Baptists are realizing that that's not actually tenable. What would you say to Christians who think, what's the phrase, like not my circus, not my monkeys, or something like that, where like I'm a Christian, I'm going to go to church, but I'm not going to, maybe I'll vote because 80% of people in the state do, but I'm not going to get involved in any other sense than that. Would you say that is sort of abdicating the responsibilities that you've been talking about?
The question that I would ask to anybody who articulated that type of a position is, who is your biblical model? Like point Point to a biblical account where someone who we are clearly meant to model ourselves after, starting with Jesus Christ and working your way down, behaved in that way. They were disinterested in what was going on around them. They weren't engaging with the powers that be. They weren't in the public square condemning the evil that was present at every opportunity. Point to that person, because I don't know who they are.
Right.
Like, you go down the list, starting from the very beginning, the whole interaction between Adam and Eve and God and Satan is a political interaction. It is, who shall be in charge?
Right.
Whose law shall reign over this domain? And it's not some ethereal spiritual question. It's, what are you going to, it's about fruit. Like, what are you going to eat? What are you going to do tangibly, physically with your life? And is that in alignment with what you've been commanded from the person who has the authority to rule?
Right.
That is a political question. And you go down the list of every account from there until the very end, and it's all about who's in charge, what is right and wrong, how you should behave, how you should act, in which context. And all of our models, all of them, were raucous. They were controversial. They were in the thick of it. They were advisors to the king, or they were standing in the king's court and telling him what he ought to do.
Right.
Right. I keep going back to Moses and Pharaoh because it's one of my favorite examples, because of the context in which Moses was operating. Moses didn't know it was going to take 10 times. Right? He had no idea. He didn't know. When he went in there, I like to think about like the 7th time, which I might be getting it wrong, but I think it might have been the hail of, okay, we've done this 6 times before. I'm going in there. I'm telling him the country's already been devastated by plague and by illness, and the cattle have all died. And now I'm telling him there's going to be hail with fire intermingled in it. That's got to be the nail in the coffin. That's got to convince.
Come on, Pharaoh.
And it took 3 more times of walking into that court. To me, that is such an object lesson of both the attitude that we should have about how we engage with the world around us, the persistence, the faithfulness, that we're doing this because it's the right thing to do, not because we think it's going to be objectively, strategically effective.
Sure.
The objectively strategic, effective result of Moses walking into that court of Pharaoh, who regarded himself and was regarded by others as the God of the universe at the time, the objective result of that interaction should have been the first time his execution on the spot.
Right.
But he was able to go in there 9 more times.
Right.
So, that's that. I think the lessons that we draw from those accounts should inform how we actually act, not just how we think and pray and feel and believe and worship, the songs that we sing in church, but what we do on the ground in real physical life, engaging with the institutions around us.
That makes perfect sense to me. I think that's an extremely biblical way of putting it. So you're saying Christians who think that we shouldn't engage too much in politics, don't get our hands dirty, look at our forebears in the faith: Daniel, Moses, John the Baptist, Jesus Christ, Paul with Agrippa. As you were talking, I was just thinking, that's so true. There's so many examples, and very few, if any, examples, as you said, of people in the Bible who are like, nope, I'm just gonna walk away from that.
There is one that comes to mind.
Jonah.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. And look how that turned out.
Exactly.
I love that.
It is, and there's probably others if I could spend some more time thinking about it. But I mean, there are examples of people who took the attitude that you described, which is that's not my problem. Nineveh's not my problem. Right. Those people are terrible. I'm glad I'm not them. Like that kind of pharisaical attitude of, thank you, Lord, that I was not born a Gentile.
Yeah.
Right. And we know that attitude is condemned. That attitude is from the pit of hell.
Yeah.
And so if that's the attitude that we're bringing to our Christian walk, something is deeply wrong.
That really makes me think, just to get very specific, about the attitude that some people have, some conservatives have, toward the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul.
Yes.
Which I fully understand. And I live in St. Paul, but I'd like to say that I'm in it, but not of it. Right. There's so much going on in the Twin Cities that is really bad. So bad. And stuff that maybe we're not even seeing in other big cities in the country. Like similar stuff, but like, it's truly, I don't want to understate how bad it is, but yet if people from areas of the state where there's still some common sense, and there's people just want to live their lives and respect individual freedom, like you've been discussing. If those people give up on the Twin Cities, we're in a bad place.
Yeah.
And if legislators give up on the Twin Cities,
100%.
That's really interesting. And I think that's something that Christians need to think about. Obviously, like you and I probably have seen this, where there's Christians who are so into the Twin Cities and that as a mission field that they maybe do not look at the big picture and not see just because they're looking at the Twin Cities and it doesn't seem possible to reform the Twin Cities politically. So they're not talking about that. They're only talking about the gospel and the homeless issue or something like that. And that's really good. But what you're talking about is we need to think of, to talk about it biblically, we need to think of the good of the city, even if it seems like the people in that city are so loath to hear that.
Yeah. I mean, so one of the interesting reversals that has happened over the past few years, you bring up libertarianism and this idea of local control. Local control as a concept has been appropriated by the left in defense of the absurdity that governs Minneapolis and St. Paul. And what I've come to realize and have tried to put out there into the public discourse is the realization that local control, the whole concept of the lesser magistrate is a solid concept, just as liberty itself is a solid concept. But like any good political concept, it still requires that underlying moral and religious people, right? There has to be, like, at the heart of any political or economic system lies the individual actor. And the integrity and virtue and productivity of the individual actor in combination with the general disposition of everyone else is what determines the success or failure of the system. You're not going to come up with a system that somehow compensates for everybody in it acting like criminals and thugs,
sure,
and dishonorable reprobates. And so to bring that to the level of municipalities, when Minneapolis and St. Paul and Ramsey County and Hennepin decide that they're not going to prosecute crime, that they're going to tolerate homeless camps all over the place, that they're going to invite and even celebrate licentiousness and degeneracy, I, out in Albertville, am not somehow immunized from the cultural impact of that, or the fiscal impact of
Absolutely.
that. That crime is eventually going to cross the Crow River into Wright County. The ideas, the cultural rot is eventually going to impact me. And so even from a self-serving standpoint, I have an interest in ministering to the Twin Cities and Minneapolis and St. Paul. But then you bring in the Christian aspect, and what is the Great Commission? Go forth and make disciples of all the nations. There's no exemption in there for Minneapolis and St. Paul or any other place where Nineveh or any of these places. And so we should be going forth to make disciples. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean pious peoples who sit in their houses and go to their house church on Sunday and never apply any of it to their actual real life. Making a disciple is encouraging somebody to act out their faith in the crazy concept that they actually believe it's real, right? That they actually believe that it matters, that it has some sort of impact upon the real world. And if you get people who are willing to do that, it doesn't, I go back to the account of Abraham arguing with God over how many righteous men he needs to find in Sodom before he spares it, right? The number isn't that high of the number of people who need to be righteous, which means to be justified and to be working out their salvation and to be sanctifying themselves and working towards that. It doesn't take that many people to purify, or at least purify is a strong word, at least grant some, like the angel of death will pass over that community if there are just a few righteous people who are working to make it a better place.
The people whose lights are shining in the darkness.
Yes.
God prospers them so that their work has much more good effect than the evil effect of those people around them, like
Yes.
on a per capita, per person basis.
Light is objectively more powerful than dark. Darkness actually has no power.
Sure.
It's the absence of power.
Right.
Right. And so it's such a great metaphor. And God, through his eternal wisdom and majesty, exhibited all these things metaphorically in his creation. Like the actual physical way that light works in the real world versus darkness is a perfect metaphor for his truth, his word, his way of being, his nature, as compared to its opposite.
I love that. This is on another level from what I expected us to be talking about, which is your work at the legislature. And I do want to definitely focus on that. But what you're talking about now is like our Christian witness, which is the most important thing that we have, in this world. And that does get me thinking about something that our audience knows about our Church Ambassador Network. And through that initiative, we're bringing pastors from across the state, from War Road and every other corner. We're bringing them to the state capitol to meet with and pray for legislators, among other things that it does. Have you been able to meet with pastors during your time?
Yes. And it's been such a blessing. Such a blessing. In fact, my absolute favorite narrative experience of the 2023 legislative session and the year as a whole has been meeting Jeff Evans and Joshua and the other pastors who work in the Church Ambassador Network, and having those touchstones, those moments where they would always come to my office when, whether I realized it or not, I needed to hear from them. And I needed that encouragement. And I needed that recentering, that reconnection. But I grew to very quickly gain a high level of affection for them. And then I met John Helmsberger, your current. Has that transition actually taken place yet?
Not until the end of the year.
Okay.
Yeah.
So your current president, I can still say.
Mm-hmm.
I met him at a meeting and we had a brief conversation. And I was like, oh, I really like this guy. This is a good guy. And then I went to your guys' gala. And he made the announcement that he was stepping down, and I was my countenance fell. I was like, oh man, I was just getting to know this guy who seemed so awesome. And then they announced that Jeff was taking over, and it was like a rocket ship to the moon. I'm like, this is awesome.
That's so great.
I'm so glad that this is the direction things are going. And so, yeah, no, it's been a tremendous blessing, and I'm so glad. I listened to one of your recent episodes where Jeff talked about the rationale behind this space here, which is very close to the Capitol, walking distance, and being that resource for us legislators. And I very much look forward to it. I will make heavy use in 2024.
That's so great. And yeah, it is a 5-minute walk from here to the rotunda. Yeah. If you walk quickly.
Sure.
Although your office is going to be, and maybe this is a sore spot, but are you going to be in Centennial this next, or only after the session? I
don't know for sure. I believe it's after the session.
Okay.
The way it was explained to me, and think these things change as time goes on, is that as soon as we adjourn sine die at the end of the session, we're basically going to be immediately kicked out of our offices. So we won't be in the SOB anymore.
This is kind of inside baseball, folks who are watching and listening. But the state government is going to spend $500 million, some insane amount, refurbishing the state office building where legislators have their offices. And okay, I love the building. I think it's fine. If it needs to be fixed, that's great. Let's do it. But this huge expansion, and what I just noticed yesterday, which is killing me because I have a bit of a tree hugger thing going on, and that's my own problem. I'm dealing with it. But they cut down these gorgeous old trees, kitty corner between the state office building and the Capitol. And they must have just done it yesterday because I was driving home and I saw that. That made me sick. It just, okay, yeah, sometimes you need to cut down trees, but I just think it's just so craven the way they're doing it. And that is really not our main focus for today. But as a consequence, legislators are going to be pushed into a somewhat inferior office space after the end of this legislative session for a couple of years.
I think the silver lining of that, though, is we could use the humbling, right? Like putting us in cubicles for a couple of years might get us in the right attitude of how we should be approaching our job. So.
Maybe you're in that office, and I'm sure your perspective on that is more valuable than mine. That's good. So folks, you heard it from the horse's mouth. Representative Hudson says, bring your pastor to the Capitol. Have those, and we're trying to recruit hundreds of new pastors for this coming session so that every legislator meets with multiple pastors from their district. And that is our goal. We're not there yet. And we need your help, folks at home, to talk to your pastor, get them on our list. Just go to mfc.org/churches. That's all you need to remember. Sign up. We'll get in touch. We'll bring you down to the Capitol. So, you saw the ups and downs of the insane 2023 session, as we've discussed. What was your proudest moment, your biggest accomplishment in your first year? And what do you think was the hardest moment?
So my proudest moment, I've actually tried to keep relatively quiet. But I have to answer the question honestly, right? So it was not one of my more raucous, public, rabble-rousing, rhetorical moments that I'm probably more known for.
You've definitely gone viral, and I've seen those clips. And to be honest with you, and I'm not just trying to make you sound good or something, but I was like, red states are looking at this and they're like, why can't we have people like that? Honestly. Sure. Because I watch clips from red state legislatures sometimes, and sometimes it's good, but other times I'm like, they need more people like Representative Hudson, or I could name other names, but you're here now, so I won't. And anyway, continue. So not the viral moments. Yeah. So there was a bill that came before. One of the committees I'm on is the Children and Families Committee, and there was a bill that came before us that was the Indian Family Preservation Act, I believe it's called. And I could go, I'll try to avoid going into the weeds of its origins and why it came. But basically the effect of the bill was to try to do everything possible within the context of state agencies to ensure that the children of tribal citizens remain with their family, as opposed to being placed, if they have to be taken out of their immediate home, that they're given to a grandparent or an uncle or something along those lines, as opposed to being sent somewhere across the state with somebody who they don't know and aren't related to and has no idea what their culture is like. And so I had really kind of a nerdy technical question about how that bill worked. And so I sent an email to the author, Representative Heather Keeler, Democrat, who's the vice chair of the Children and Families Committee, asking her, hey, what can you explain this to me? And her response to the fact that I cared at all about this bill was so immense. She was just so grateful and happy that somebody cared enough to ask. And so she responded with much more than I asked for in terms of, here's the background, here's some people you should talk to, here's where this all came from and what it was about. And ultimately, I was able to play some role in influencing our caucus on the Republican side to, at the end of the day, unanimously pass this thing off the floor. Oh, that's great.
And it was not something that, I didn't wake up that morning or enter that month thinking that was what was going to happen. But the argument that I made to the caucus was, look, at the heart of this thing is everything that we believe in. They're talking about sovereignty. They're talking about family. Mm-hmm. They're talking about the tradition and the integrity of culture and how important these are all things that we're on board with. Yeah. And so to have an opportunity to showcase that and say, this is what conservatism is about. This is what the Republican message is centered on. And it's fantastic that, for whatever coincidental reason, it happens to align with the Democrats' priorities in this one instant. Mm-hmm. To me, that was a bright light in the midst of what was otherwise a very dark legislative session.
Absolutely. I'm sure that I have seen this before, and I hope I'll see more of it, where safeguarding kids can actually be one of those few places where bipartisanship is still possible, whether it's reforming the foster system. I've seen that. And even protecting kids online. This is something that I've talked about with a couple people recently, and you're probably familiar at least a little bit with bills that have been passed in other states for age verification of adult sites that have been bipartisan. Mm-hmm. And there's also a bill passed by not bipartisan, as far as I'm aware, in California. It's basically saying, the idea is we have certain things need to be designed so that they're child friendly and child safe. Well, the internet is accessible for children. So in other words, if let's say the gap between stair railings at a public building was so wide that a 2-year-old could fall to his death.
Right.
That would be illegal.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, let's think about the sometimes deadly, but also not deadly, but the harms that can befall a child in it. Click, 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 right? Yep. You know that, I know that, because we're parents, if not for any other reason. But Democrats in California, of all places, they're saying maybe we need to say that the internet needs to be safe for children, at least in some way, while protecting freedom of speech. And of course, the adult industry and Facebook, they're all against this. And I saw that Senator Aaron May Quaid and others have introduced a similar bill in Minnesota. Now, I haven't looked at the bill. Maybe you haven't looked at the bill. So I don't know if this is something that I would support, but I just love to see the heart there. Yeah, because taking down some corporations that want to profit off children while making the internet safer for kids, I mean, that's going to be something where that's going to be close to my heart. What do you think about that type of thing?
No, absolutely. So one of my pet peeves, rhetorically and conceptually in the law, is the abuse of the concept of freedom of speech in particular. So freedom of speech is deferred to justify all sorts of behaviors that are not speech,
right?
That have nothing whatsoever to do with political expression and that are objectively harmful. So, blocking a freeway, taking over an intersection,
right?
They even call it shutting down infrastructure. None of those things are speech, not by any definition of the word. And so your freedom to express yourself, to petition your government for redress of grievance, is not impeded by me telling you to get out of the road.
Right.
Right. It is also not impeded by my telling you that you will not put smut in front of kids. And this is something that, it's really bizarre to me, because we've apparently only had to have this argument in recent years. This has been universally understood as you don't even have to articulate the distinction for virtually the entirety of our nation's existence up until about 5 minutes ago.
Right.
Now, all of a sudden, people are pretending that they don't understand what the curation of content means, that we just let anything into our libraries. We just let anything into our syllabi and our schools and our curriculum. And that if you have any sort of standard whatsoever that says you will include this and not include that, that's somehow a violation of free speech. No, you can get together with your I'll forgive my crudeness, but your skanky friends and indulge in that all you want privately in your own home.
As adults.
But you're not going to be able to do that in front of my kids. You're not going to be able to include my kid in that.
Absolutely not.
And there's nothing about that conviction that in any way encroaches upon freedom of speech.
Thank you. Oh my gosh. I told you before we started filming that I had been talking with a Libertarian, that was while we were filming, actually. And he was like, no way are we doing age verification, no skin off my nose. He was like, he'll make noises about parents need to keep their kids safe. Yeah. But the idea that the state government should do anything to affect that,
so let me directly respond to that sentiment.
Yeah.
Parents should keep their kids safe. Matt Walsh speaks to this. The idea that I, as a parent, am solely responsible for keeping my child safe is utterly absurd and goes against everything we've been talking about this entire time. I mean, you made the reference to the distance between the gaps in the stair rail, right? In terms of a 2-year-old being able to fall through. That's obviously a communal responsibility.
Absolutely.
Like, you have a responsibility as a property owner, and we have a responsibility as a society to impose regulation that requires you to protect children by having that space appropriately narrow. And in similar fashion, we as a society have a responsibility to impose upon folks who want to engage in morally ambiguous behavior, that they are not going to subject that intentionally or unintentionally to our children. That is not a responsibility that I as a parent am not solely burdened with having to constantly actively shield my child from all of the depravity that anybody around me wants to engage in. No, they have an affirmative responsibility to not expose my child to that depravity.
Right.
And if they violate that, they should be on the wrong side of the law.
This is a breath of fresh air. I love to hear that. And you're talking about, and I think some conservatives need to hear this. They need to hear that protecting kids must be done while also protecting individual freedoms.
Yes.
Those things are not incompatible.
Not at all. One of the things, I spent a lot of time, everybody goes through these different phases of ideological kind of ruts. And one of my ruts was with Ayn Rand and objectivism and
sure.
Atlas Shrugged and all of this. And one of the things that she said that has always stuck with me, and I believe 100% to be true, is that an actual principle never, ever comes into conflict with another principle. And so this idea that we have to balance individual rights with the protection of children, no. Where there's a seeming incongruity between those two priorities, you're not perceiving reality correctly.
Yeah.
Okay. Because the individual right, that child has an individual right to not be subjected to your depravity.
Right. Absolutely.
And so what we're actually doing is upholding that child's right and upholding their parents' right to fulfill their responsibility to that child by limiting your action. And that is the essence of the law. Every single law we have is a limitation upon your action to prevent you from violating the rights of somebody else. So spare me.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Representative Hudson. That, I think, is probably the most cogent explanation of that seeming incongruity, as you said, that we've had on this podcast, because it comes up a lot.
Yeah.
As we deal with current events and talking about what conservatives are doing, and sometimes conservatives fighting with each other and things like that about that exact issue. So we're coming in for landing. I want to ask you about something you posted on Twitter recently, talking about coming on this show. You posted a Bible verse, and what I took from that is that you're talking about Christians having a prophetic role based on the Proverbs passage that you shared in our society, and specifically to call out and name the workers of evil.
Yeah.
Can you talk more about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, and I'm not the first person to talk about this, and hopefully I won't be the last, but there's this kind of modern Christian-esque idea out there that our responsibility as Christians, professing Christians, is to be quote unquote Christ-like. And what people mean by that is apparently not to actually behave the way Christ did, because the implication is we should just be nice all the time, and everything we say should be edifying, and every word that falls out of our mouths should result in people going, oh, isn't that nice? Yes, I like that. When in point of fact, if you look at, again, Christ as the best model of how we ought to behave, but then, of course, all of the images that preceded him of prophets and folks who walked in righteousness alongside God, they were all offensive people. Okay? Yep. All of them.
Without exception.
Without exception, they offended virtually everyone who they came into contact with. And the reason why is because it's said, I actually have the verse outside my office over at the state office building, where people hated the light because they loved the darkness, because their works are evil, right? They don't want to have to acknowledge the fact that there is a light, there is a standard, there is a God. And so when you bring that up, they're going to recoil, they're going to lash out, they're going to want to crucify you ultimately. That's what they're going to want to do.
Right.
And so when Jesus tells us to pick up your cross and follow him, is that a metaphor? Sure. Can it be literal? You bet it can be literal, right? Of like, you need to be willing to die in every way, metaphorically and actually, in order to follow me, in order to stand for who I am and what I And if we're not willing to do that, then I don't understand. Like I actually think it's a special kind of blasphemy to claim to be a Christian and not be willing to do that. And I think there's biblical reason to suspect that the punishment for presenting yourself as somebody who is of God and of Christ, but when the pressure is turned up and the heat is turned up and you're not willing to stand on what's true, that you're gonna pay a real price for that.
Absolutely.
Right? And the other distinction that I want to make is it's not as though, because Jeff Evans, your incoming president here at the Minnesota Family Council, talked in a recent episode about the importance of balancing love or truth and grace, I believe was the distinction. Mm-hmm. And I loved the way that he articulated it. What I would add to his analysis, if I could be so bold, is that context matters, right? So my primary example of this is the pulpit on Sunday versus the hospital bed.
Sure.
Okay. So a pastor at the pulpit on Sunday, if he's worth his salt, is pounding the pulpit, thumping the Bible, talking about hellfire and brimstone and sin and righteousness and preaching the gospel. Okay. That same guy, intimidating, offensive from the pulpit, when he goes to visit you at the hospital, he's gentle, he's warm, he's listening, he's accepting, he's kind, she's showing you the grace of God. The balance very much depends on the context.
Yeah.
And so the context that I'm operating in as a legislator, I'm in the public square, I'm in a political arena, I'm dealing with the laws that are going to govern my neighbor. And if I love my neighbor as I love myself, then I'm going to fight tooth and nail to ensure that those laws are righteous and uphold his rights and uphold the holiness of the God who I serve. Okay. So that means that I might not always be nice in terms of how I approach that fight. Just like a soldier is probably not going to be nice in the way that he approaches the task that is before him. That doesn't make him less godly. That doesn't make him less Christ-like.
Right. But
that's the context in which he finds himself. And it's an appropriate way to balance truth and grace in that role, in that moment. And so I think that this is possibly the chief deficit of the modern church, is that we have lost all sense of context, and we have convinced ourselves that we just need to do the nice thing in any given moment, in any given role, no matter what that is, and no matter what the effect of being nice, quote unquote, is, which is often being permissive and allowing licentiousness and depravity and evil to prevail.
That's great. And I don't want to repeat you, but as you were talking, I was just thinking about Christ with the Pharisees and Christ with the Syrophoenician woman. To the same Savior, the same Messiah, who is perfectly God and perfectly man and never contradicts himself, but in two different contexts. That's great. That's extremely good. I was also thinking about St. Nicholas, because last night I went to an Advent service and a St. Nicholas Day service. So shout out to Trinity Lutheran in Farmington, where we were visiting. And the pastor talked about St. Nicholas as someone who cared deeply about Christian doctrine and fought for it at the Council of Nicaea, and who was also most famous for giving gifts to the poor of the city, hence everything about Christmas, St. Nicholas, and who also wasn't afraid to punch a heretic, allegedly. So that's at least three different ways in which St. Nicholas modeled Christ.
Right.
And so that I'm loving that. That's amazing. Okay, this is my last question, I swear. What gives you hope for Minnesota?
Well, what gives me hope for Minnesota, and perhaps specifying it to Minnesota is too narrowing.
Sure.
Right? Do I have hope for Minnesota? Absolutely. Because God is a redeemer. And he loves to swoop in at the last minute and just defeat the enemy. He's done it time and time again. And so can Minnesota be brought back from the brink? Absolutely. But my actual hope is in just the general knowledge that good prevails ultimately.
Amen.
Like light wins.
Yeah.
God has already defeated sin. And so whether or not Minnesota ultimately is saved as a state is immaterial to the ultimate victory.
Sure.
Number one. But number two, as Christians, we're called to bear witness where we find ourselves. And as you know, when you were talking earlier about the Twin Cities, that's where the greatest opportunity lies to show the power of the gospel. I mean, you talk about homelessness. This is a great example. How do we solve homelessness? Well, the world's answer is we tax people and we reallocate that money and we build a bunch of housing and we pay everybody's mortgage and then everybody will have a home.
Right.
And that's how we're going to solve homelessness. We know the actual answer to the question, which is we foster virtue. If you foster virtue in the individual person, if you make disciples, a disciple is going to be virtuous, they're going to be productive, they're going to have honor, they're going to have faith, they're going to have hope. If you foster those characteristics in individuals, they're not going to be homeless.
Right.
That's the answer.
Yeah.
And so there's tremendous opportunity that we find in this moment, certainly in this state, but just in the entire world, to demonstrate the hope that is unique on our side. It can't be found anywhere else. And we've got countless examples, if we go back and we look, the war on poverty all the way down, that these ideas that they keep slinging of, well, just throw more money at it.
Yep.
Just redistribute it. Just attack the privilege, quote unquote. It doesn't work. It never has. It never will.
Yep.
What does work and always has and always will is fostering virtue and productivity and honor and hope in the individual and families. And that is there's going to be such a cornucopia of fruit that comes from those relationships and those values that you're not going to have to worry about social problems.
Yeah. Folks, you heard it here first. The light will overcome the darkness. Love will overcome hate. There's hope for us in this state as Christians, for this state, but also for us as part of the global church of Christ, the bride of Christ, doing his will here on earth. And I think what a great message going into Christmas. The light will overcome darkness. Representative Hudson, I want to thank you so much for being here today. This has been extremely illuminating. I'm sure it will be for our audience as well. I wanted to say one quick word as we come in towards the end of the year. Minnesota Family Council is a 100% donor-supported organization, and we receive more than 50% of our donations here in these last few weeks of the year. So if it is important to you to have a voice for life, family, and religious freedom at the Capitol in St. Paul and throughout the state, please consider making a contribution at mfc.org/donate. We want to be your voice, and we want to partner with you to do that. So thank you so much for watching and listening to this episode of The Family Beacon. We'll be back next week. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to or watching this episode of the Family Beacon podcast from Minnesota Family Council. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you're up to date on life, family, and religious freedom. You can follow us on Instagram at MN Family Council and subscribe to us on YouTube to watch our content. Get the facts, stand for truth.